I am doing Chapter 8 of the ADA, which covers special rooms, spaces, and elements. An overview of everything we cover in this is wheelchair spaces, companion seats, and designated aisle seats, then dressing, fitting, and locker rooms, kitchens and kitchenettes, medical care and long-term care facilities, transient lodging guest rooms, which are like hotels and motels, holding cells and housing cells, courtrooms, residential dwelling units, which I believe are like apartments, transportation facilities, and storage. So starting with wheelchair spaces, companion seats, and designated aisle seats. So there's a lot of very specific information and measurements, which I will cover some of, but I'm pretty much just going to cover the main points for each. So for wheelchair spaces, the first consideration is floor or ground surface. Any floor and or ground surfaces must be stable, firm, and slip resistant. So for carpet, for example, there are a lot of specific requirements, usually regarding carpet's backing and pile height, because carpet can significantly increase the amount of force needed to propel a wheelchair over a surface. Additionally, openings generally need to be less than half an inch in diameter, and slopes can be no steeper than a 2% incline or decline. Exceptions to these requirements for floor and ground space exist in places such as animal containment areas or places of sport. And then width. So the width there needs to be for a single wheelchair space must be at least 36 inches wide. But if there's two wheelchair spaces adjacent to each other, then each wheelchair space can be 33 inches wide at least. For depth, it depends on if a wheelchair can enter a space from the front or rear. So you can see in the bottom picture that a wheelchair space needs to be 48 inches deep minimum if you can enter from the front or rear, but if you can only enter from the side, it needs to be 60 inches deep minimum. And then approach. So wheelchair spaces must be connected to accessible routes, but accessible routes cannot overlap with wheelchair spaces, which means that access to any wheelchair space can't be through another wheelchair space. And then overlap. So wheelchair spaces cannot overlap circulation paths, which are the aisle width required by building or safety codes. But if a circulation path or aisle width is wider than what is required by the applicable codes, then the wheelchair space can enter into the access space. Okay, and then next is lines of sight. At any event with like a screen or a performance area or a playing field, spectators in wheelchairs should have a line of sight over other people's heads or other spectators in general. And the line of sight that should exist is kind of based off the line of sight that someone would have in any non-wheelchair space. So for example, if general spectators have lines of sight over the heads of spectators in the first row, then spectators seated in wheelchair spaces should also have a line of sight over the heads of spectators in the first row. And this also applies whether spectators are seated or standing, and also between the heads of spectators. If it's an event where people are going to be expected to be standing, then wheelchair spaces should generally have a line of sight over standing people, like in the very bottom picture. Companion seats and designated aisle seats. So a companion seat is any seat next to a wheelchair space. And one requirement is that they need to be aligned. So in row seating, companion seats must provide shoulder alignment with wheelchair spaces that are next to them. And that's kind of measured generally 36 inches from the front of the wheelchair space. So the goal is that people are like sitting next to each other as they would in any other row. And then the floor of a companion seat and a wheelchair space need to be at the same elevation, so people are at the same level as well. And then companion seats must also be equal in size, quality, and comfort, and any amenities to seating in the surrounding area. And companion seats must also be movable. Designated aisle seats are seats that are intended for people who have difficulty walking. So For designated aisle seats, there's a couple of requirements. For example, where there are armrests on seats in the surrounding area, armrests on designated aisle seats must be folding or retractable on the aisle side. And they also must be identified by a sign or marker. It's suggested that these signs or markers have contrast and be photoluminescent, but this is not required. In the example, you can kind of see this is the Capitol Theater in Yakima, just like them identifying where are companion seats. The next section is dressing, fitting, and locker rooms. For partitions or doors in locker rooms, as a general rule, any of these partitions or doors need to ensure the same amount of privacy to all users. So they need to go low enough so that anyone in a wheelchair would have the same amount of privacy that a standing person would. And then additionally, benches must be at the same height as a typical wheelchair seat, which is 17 to 19 inches off the ground. But this guideline does not consider where wheelchair seats may be lower, like for children or people of shorter stature. Turning space. Any turning spaces must comply with the requirements set in Chapter 3 of the ADA. So that means there cannot be a slope steeper than 2%. And then aside from this, requirements kind of vary by space shape. So as you can see in the examples, a circular space shape needs to be 60 inches in diameter and should also include knee and toe clearance. And then a T-shaped space would have different requirements. It needs to kind of be within a 60-inch square. And then a door swing. So doors are allowed to swing into turning spaces, but they generally cannot swing into a room unless there's enough clearance space beyond the arc of the door swing. So there needs to be like a space that's 30 by 48 inches minimum. Extras that would not be touched by the door opening. Coat hooks and shelves. Coat hooks need to be within a reachable range, and that range varies pretty widely by age and by the angle someone is reaching from. So there's a lot of different requirements for that. And then there's also requirements for shelves, which is that they must be 40 to 48 inches from the ground. And kitchens and kitchenettes. Okay, so clearance depends on the shape of the kitchen. So in kitchens where everything is on two opposing sides of the walls, clearance through the middle needs to be at least 40 inches. And there should also be two entries. Kitchens that are more of a U shape need to have a clearance that's about 60 inches minimum. And work surface. Okay, so counter space. These requirements vary, but in a residential dwelling unit, there must be at least 30 inches wide counter space to work on. But again, this varies by the place you're in. Ground space. So on the ground, there needs to be space for a forward approach. And there also needs to be knee and toe clearance. So you can see in the picture on the right what that looks like, where there's kind of enough space for someone to go in and also have room for their knees and their feet underneath. There can be cabinets beneath counters in the kitchen or the kitchen workspace. However, they would have to meet certain conditions. So they need to be able to be removed. And when you remove them, they need to have the same flooring, so like the same level of flooring and the same walls surrounding it. Height, counters can be 34 inches maximum above the ground, but there are exceptions if you have an adjustable counter. And then exposed surfaces. There obviously can't be any sharp or abrasive surfaces underneath counters that would injure anyone. And then sinks. Okay, so sinks must comply with a bunch of requirements in Chapter 6, which also provides the requirements for sinks in bathrooms. So some of these are ground space, so like a counter, there must be enough space for forward approach and for knee and toe clearance, and the same cabinet exceptions apply below sinks as do in kitchens. There are also some additional requirements for children specifically. Height, also like kitchen counter height, sinks must be 34 inches max above the ground, but there are exceptions for adjustable counters. And then faucets must comply with requirements in Chapter 3, which means there are guidelines for ground space and height, and faucets should be operable with one hand and not require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting, and should not require more than 5 pounds of force. Exposed pipes and surface. So any pipes below sinks must be insulated or otherwise positioned to avoid contact with anyone. And there should also obviously be no sharp or abrasive surfaces so that no one gets injured. Storage is also covered in this section. However, I cover storage generally later, which has the exact same requirements. So I'll cover it then. Appliances. So there's, again, requirements for ground space and operable parts. Pretty much the same requirements regarding ground space and operable parts that I've been discussing up to this point apply to appliances, but there are exceptions for certain appliances. Dishwashers. So dishwashers need to be surrounded by clear ground space, even when the dishwasher door is open. With the dishwasher door open, there should also be enough ground space to still use the sink. So one example you can kind of see in the right picture where there's enough space to get around the dishwasher and still use the sink. And then range cooktop. So for ranges or cooktops with a forward approach, there needs to be knee and toe clearance and also insulation to prevent any burns or injuries. Additionally, all of the controls should be placed in a way that doesn't require reaching across burners. So you can see in the example too, there's like clearly enough space for knee and toe clearance, and all the controls are right in the front. Ovens are similar to dishwashers. They need to be surrounded by clear ground space even when opened, and oven controls should also be placed on the front. Fridges and freezers, combination fridges and freezers should have at least 50% of their space no more than 54 inches above the ground, and they should have enough space in front of them for a parallel approach, and also at least 2 feet of clear space in front of them. Medical care and long-term care facilities. Again, requirements for turning and ground space, they're exactly the same as ones I previously discussed in wheelchair spaces and in dressing, fitting, and locker rooms. And then toilet and bathing rooms. So any private restrooms in a care facility must comply with Chapter 6, which provides various regulations. Turning spaces must comply with the requirements previously discussed, but required clearances and turning spaces can overlap in bathrooms in these spaces. Doors can swing into turning space, but generally not into required clearance or ground space still. However, there are exceptions for different kinds of places. Also, mirrors must be a maximum of 35 to 40 inches off the ground, depending on their placement. And coat hooks and shelves must also be accessible, just as in dressing, fitting, and locker rooms. If there's just one general restroom, then no fewer than one toilet, sink, and bathtub or shower must comply with these requirements and other requirements for bathrooms in Chapter 6. Okay, transient lodging and guest rooms. So these pretty much have 2 different types of requirements. So mobility features and communication features. For mobility features, starting with any like living, dining, or exterior areas such as a balcony, for example, all of these spaces need to be accessible and need to be able to be reached by everyone. And then sleeping areas. So at least one sleeping area must have clear ground space on both sides of the bed that would allow for a parallel approach to the side of the bed. However, there are exceptions in rooms with multiple beds. And then toilet and bathing facilities. Toilets and bathing rooms are generally subject to the same kind of requirements as they are in medical care and long-term care facilities. However, there may be additional requirements from Chapter 6, for example, regarding roll-in shower compartments and toilet or bathing fixtures. Additionally, if there's vanity countertop space in restrooms, then comparable vanity countertop space must exist in accessible restrooms. Kitchen and turning space requirements are the same as the ones we previously discussed in guest lodging. Communication features, so for example, alarm systems need to also have audible and visible features. The requirements for that are discussed in Chapter 7. And then notification devices also. In guest rooms with communication features, visible notification devices should be provided to alert guests of incoming phone calls or a door knock or a bell, for example. And these devices also need to comply with further requirements in Chapter 3 and Chapter 7, regarding volume control and electrical outlet sources. Holding and housing cells. So the mobility and communication features required in holding and housing cells are all requirements that we already discussed just previously. Turning space, benches, and beds are all subject to requirements previously discussed. Toilet and bathing facilities are subject to the same requirements we already discussed. Additionally, where audible alarms are provided, visual alarms must also be provided, and telephones within holding cells or housing cells must have volume controls as discussed in Chapter 7. Next is courtrooms. There's some more specific requirements for courtrooms. So for turning space, any areas in a courtroom that are raised or lowered and accessed by either ramps or platform lifts must provide unobstructed turning space in compliance with previously discussed regulations. Clear floor space. So each jury box and witness stand must have accessible floor space, just as we previously discussed. And however, where jury boxes or witness stands are raised and ramp or platform lift access would be hazardous, wheelchair spaces can be located outside of the jury box or witness stand. So I'm assuming these are spaces that are pretty high raised where it just wouldn't be safe. And then judge benches and courtroom stations. So judge benches, clerk stations, bailiff stations, deputy clerk stations, court reporter stations, and litigants and counsel stations must comply with Chapter 9, which sets various regulations for work surfaces. And then pictured is just an accessible, I believe that might be a witness stand, residential dwelling units. First is accessible routes. So any residential dwelling unit must have accessible routes in compliance with Chapter 4, except for in unfinished attics or basements. There must be at least one accessible route that connects all spaces which are part of the residential dwelling unit. And if there is only one accessible route, it cannot pass through spaces like bathrooms or closets. Additionally, turning spaces requirements must be met in every room served by an accessible route. However, turning spaces are not required in small exterior spaces, so spaces that are 30 inches maximum in depth or width. Kitchens must comply with the requirements we already discussed, and then toilet and bathing facilities. So at least one toilet and bathing facility must comply with the requirements we previously discussed. Additionally, no fewer than one of each type of fixture provided shall be accessible, so sinks, showers, toilets, everything like that. And these fixtures should also be located in the same toilet and bathing area so that someone doesn't have to travel to different parts of the unit to get access to an accessible fixture. Communication features. So where there's a fire alarm, it needs to be extended to a point within the vicinity of the smoke detection system. And this is because it makes it more likely to be alerted when the fire alarm and smoke detection system are kind of connected. Alarm appliances. So alarm appliances should have audible and visible features as discussed in Chapter 7. Smoke detection systems specifically must comply with any applicable standards in Chapter 1, and visible alarm appliances should be interconnected so as to provide notification for both smoke detection and fire alarm activation. And they must just be for this purpose. So you can't have one communication system for like a doorbell, for example, and that also be used for smoke and fire alarms. Primary entrance requirements. So communication features must also be provided at the primary entrance of a residential dwelling unit. These features include a hardwired electric doorbell that provides an audible tone and a visible signal within the unit when you press it, as well as means for visually identifying a visitor without opening the door. And the means for visually identifying a visitor should provide at least a 180-degree range of view. If there are visible doorbells in a sleeping area, they need to be able to be deactivated or turned off so that people can sleep in peace. And finally, any system permitting voice communication must be capable of also supporting TTY or teletypewriter communication, as discussed in Chapter 7. Transportation facilities. So I'm going to start with bus areas. Bus boarding and alighting areas, they need to have a firm, stable surface and must be connected to streets, sidewalks, or pedestrian paths by an accessible route. These areas must be at least 96 inches long and 60 inches wide. There's also different requirements for slopes, whether they're parallel or perpendicular to the roadway, but generally slopes still can't be steeper than 2% incline or decline. Bus shelters must comply with the ground space requirements that we've discussed, and they also must be connected by an accessible route to the boarding and alighting area. Bus route identification signs must comply with communication accessibility requirements in Chapter 7. However, bus schedules, timetables, and maps posted like at bus stops or inside bus shelters do not. Next, we have railroad requirements. Rail platforms. So in all directions, rail platforms cannot have a slope greater than 2%, but there are exceptions for existing platforms serving vehicles that are on existing track or laid in existing roadway. So in those cases, there's different requirements, again, depending on if the platform is parallel to the roadway or existing track. Generally, the slope has to be kind of equal to the platform or existing track. Platform boarding edges that aren't protected by platform screens or guards also need to have some kind of detectable warnings compliant with Chapter 7 along the entire public portion of the platform. So anywhere someone could walk or have access to. And there's a wide variety of applicable requirements for platform and vehicle floor coordination. So this kind of means like the space between where you get on the train and the space where you are sitting before you get on the train. So there's, like I said, there's various requirements, but generally they have to be at least like 8 inches above where the train is. And then rail station signs. Rail stations need to have at least one sign at the entrance that is placed uniformly and then complies with raised character requirements in Chapter 7. If a station doesn't have like one defined entrance, then there needs to be at least one sign in a central location that complies with these same raised character requirements. Lists of stations, routes, and destinations served by a rail station must also be placed uniformly and comply with other communication accessibility requirements in Chapter 7. Station names should be displayed clearly and in a manner that complies with Chapter 7. They need to be clearly visible and within the lines of sight of standing and sitting passengers from within the vehicle. Like when you are riding a train or a metro and you can see the name of the station you're at, that's kind of what that's referencing. Next is just various requirements. So public address systems. So when there's public address systems or PA systems that convey any sort of audible information to the public, the same or the equivalent information must be provided in a visual format. And then clocks, where clocks are provided for public use, the elements of the clock need to be clearly visible. Hands, numbers, and digits, or numerals and digits, must contrast with the clock's background in a manner that complies with requirements in Chapter 7. Kind of like the photo I have shown, it just needs to be obvious, like black and white, very contrasting, so you can like clearly see what there is. And then escalators. Escalators must have a clear width of 32 inches minimum, and they need to comply with a bunch of building regulations. However, existing escalators and key stations kind of aren't required to comply with this, and circulation paths also around boarding platforms that cross tracks need to be accessible. Finally, we have storage. So storage has not very many requirements. In general, storage just needs to have accessible ground space like we already discussed, and the height must comply with the reach ranges specified in Chapter 3. And the operable parts must comply with requirements in Chapter 3. So kind of like we discussed in the kitchen, like you usually need to be able to use things with one hand and you don't need to like pinch or grasp too tightly or too much force isn't required. And then on the right, you can see as an example, the reach requirements like really vary by type of age someone has who's going to be using it. And also there's even more requirements based on like the angle you're reaching from. So that varies widely. And that is it. Thank you guys for listening.